What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the latest episode of The Layup.Line. My name is Dolos, and if you're new to this channel, tap that subscribe button for more NBA content like this. For today's video, I want to talk about some of the teams that will be the worst performers this upcoming season. As we all know, 16 teams make the final playoff brackets. The introduction of the play-in tournament has made it so that there are at least 10 to 11 teams in each conference trying to make a playoff appearance any given year. 6 of these 14 teams we anticipate to be picking in next year's draft lottery have rosters geared toward tanking this season, with the potential for more joining them during the season. I want to dedicate some time to tiering these 6 teams and their future assets that they've accumulated as a way to analyze the progress of their rebuilds. I'm going to split this discussion by conference real quick because there are only 2 East teams that won't at least be going for a play-in spot. Detroit and Orlando have young cores built around the last 2 number 1 overall picks. They are also both teams that had spent years dedicated to trying to be average or one of the lower tier playoff teams before deciding to trade in their vets at the perfect time, combined with lottery luck giving them some talent out of the lottery aside from the big name first picks that they have. Orlando does have a bit more firepower at this point, still having some veteran holdovers from before the blow up. Markelle Fultz, the recently injured Gary Harris, Terrence Ross, and one of the key returns in the Vucevic trade, Wendell Carter. That makes Orlando a better team than Detroit, but in a deep Eastern Conference, the goal for both of these franchises is clearly letting the young guys get experience. Looking over in the Western Conference, there are 4 teams that aren't looking to be competitive. That's going to inherently make it harder to do so since each of these teams now has to play each other. Just one thing to keep an eye on in this race for the top pick. The Houston Rockets, OKC Thunder, Utah Jazz, and San Antonio Spurs will all be aiming for top 3 picks rather than a playoff appearance. OKC is the only team in the group that didn't trade a veteran player for draft compensation, but considering they were bad enough for the 2nd pick last year and now Chet Holmgren is unfortunately injured, it's fair to expect more of the same when it comes to their win-loss total. The Rockets moved Christian Wood for a late first-round pick, and Utah and San Antonio obviously had bigger blow-ups moving actual all-stars. Utah is the biggest of all, moving 2 of their franchise players with more moves on the horizon. This does mean both of these teams are really just at the start of their rebuilds, which brings me to the tiers. Tier 1, the beginners. San Antonio is at the bottom of this for me. No offense to any Spurs fans, but they are the most disappointing team in this bunch for me personally. I just really wish that they would have committed to this direction sooner. Not to rehash history, but I think the context of the Kawhi trade failing matters here. I understand why the San Antonio Spurs of all teams didn't want to flat out rebuild, but there were better rebuilding packages that they could have gotten in return for Kawhi Leonard, better than DeMar DeRozan in a draft pick. They waited to fully rebuild until 3 to 4 years later, seasons where they were hardly relevant, and that was just a bad opportunity cost in my opinion. You can't live in the past, and at least they have decided to trend this direction in a strong draft year. They also picked up a lot of young players over the past 2 drafts, and this group seems to be built around Keldon Johnson right now, who's an impressive paint driver who will have the chance to show an expanded game this season. But they could be in position to be the worst team in the league. This year will be about finding out the players who fit this organization and who develop and grow onto this roster. They have vets like Josh Richardson and Duncan McDermott who could be moved to open up even more minutes for these young guys and help them achieve their draft day dreams. I also have the Utah Jazz in this tier. They received immense hauls and unprotected draft picks in both the Gobert and Mitchell deals. I'd argue that they probably have the best draft asset capital in the entire league now. The value of draft assets can go up or down on any given season, but if your team is competing in trade talks against the Jazz for a player, and Utah can offer unprotected picks and most of the picks that your team has to offer are other teams' protected draft picks, you're probably going to lose those negotiations. Utah will also look at an interesting gamble on a recovering Colin Sexton, who is signed to a value deal, and as previously mentioned, they might even still run the scoreboard up on picks even higher, with deals for Bogdanovich, Clarkson, and Conley for assets all on the table still. It's worth mentioning as well that they did land recent lottery pick from Cleveland, the 14th selection Ochai Agbaji, and first round pick from Minnesota, Walker Kessler. This year is seeing what these guys have, as well as first time head coach Will Hardy. I'm giving this rebuild a lot of potential. They moved on from their vets at the perfect time to maximize their return, and they're starting it with a new coach and already have youth with open roles at minutes, and they're letting you contend for the first overall pick while developing these guys. But as for the second tier of teams, these franchises have young foundations in place and at least a year of tanking so far. At the bottom of this tier, I have the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons were hailed as one of the real winners of this latest draft, landing 2 lottery prospects at positions of need. They also moved Jeremy Grant to open up playing time on the wing. And the reason they rank at the bottom of this tier is because of the lack of proven young talent outside of Cunningham. I'm very high on Ivy and Jalen Duren, but we still need to see games played and how they fit. Saddiq Bey looks to be starter material, and Isaiah Stewart is at least a rotation player. Outside of this, there are young players like Killian Hayes, Saban Lee, and Isaiah Livers who are trying to carve out a place in the league, if not with this team. They have young restoration projects like Marvin Bagley, Kevin Knox, and they can play for draft positioning while seeing what players they want to keep as foundations of this rebuild. Another reason for having Detroit at the bottom is that they just lack draft assets that some of these other teams have. While Detroit did pivot to a rebuild at the right time, they didn't have some big blockbuster trade that landed them multiple picks like many of the other teams in this video. These other teams will at some point use these picks to either move up in the draft or trade for players that help accelerate the rebuild. Also, having these picks means that some of these other teams can afford to miss on draft picks because they have other assets to make up for it. Detroit just doesn't have that luxury. Their picks need to hit, and they need to be smart about who they retain to properly build a core around Cade Cunningham. Right now, they just have less tools in the toolbox, but I do have optimism the current front office can build a competitive team around Cade. Above the Pistons, I have the Orlando Magic, similarly built around a recent number 1 overall pick, but the Magic have better depth around their young centerpiece. Unlike Detroit, the Magic did have one of those all-star for draft pick deals, and they already parlayed that value into key pieces of their future. Wendell Carter Jr. and the Bulls' 7th pick, which became Franz Wagner. I thought the Magic won the Vooch trade at the time, but the fact that they were able to draft Franz Wagner and are still owed another draft pick from Chicago makes it almost embarrassing for the Bulls. There is one thing I think the Orlando Magic need to overcome this season and the next, and that's figuring out their guard room. Markelle Fultz, Jalen Suggs, Cole Anthony, RJ Hampton, all of these guys need minutes, and based on how we see the front office prioritize these players, we'll get to see decisions on trades or extensions following up. I really like how well-rounded the Orlando Magic's roster is, but the fact that they are positioned to add another top prospect to this group has me thinking that they are going to be one of the better teams in the league in the 2020s if all goes right. The next 2 teams are extremely close in my opinion, but I have the Houston Rockets up next. I was one of those people that trashed the Rockets for their Harden trade, but it's worked out pretty okay for them. As I mentioned earlier with the Jazz having unprotected picks, that's the greatest kind of draft pick you can offer in a trade. You add that to the fact that Houston could legitimately be viewed as a free agency destination, unlike any of these other teams, and there is an argument for the Rockets to be my number one rebuilding team here. The franchise is currently built around Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, and maybe Kevin Porter Jr. Alperen Sengun also looks like somewhat of a key piece, but there are a number of developmental projects that they are hoping will pay off. Ty Washington, Usman Garuba, Tari Eason, Daishen Nix, Josh Christopher, and Kenyon Martin. Maybe they don't all become something, but they are pretty much all good rolls of the dice. Given this will be year 3 of losing, you will expect them to be ahead of the teams named earlier. Since buying out John Wall, I have 2 questions left about this franchise. First, how much do they like their current head coach? You want a team to lose when they're developing, but the losing streaks over the past 2 seasons has turned up the heat on head coach Stephen Silas. The final and larger question is Kevin Porter Jr.'s role and future with the team. He is young, but they already need to make a financial decision with him, and how those talks go and what number they agree to extend to or re-sign at will matter. Jalen Green and Jabari Smith are top picks with high scoring ability, and if everything goes right, they will hopefully be max to near max rookie extension players. In year 1 of your rebuild, the best available player is most important. By year 3, you should at least be increasing how much you value fit. If Kevin Porter Jr. doesn't fit with Green, Jabari, and Sengun, what do you do with him? And if he does, how much do you pay him? So that's one of the bigger questions for Houston this year. Wrapping things up with my top team in the Oklahoma City Thunder, this is largely because they were able to start their rebuild with a 21-year-old budding all-star. Now at 24 years old and starting the first year of his max extension, that makes this rebuild unlike any other. I don't think this means they will be forced to trade him, but I do think this can have interesting effects on how quickly they are looking to compete. This is year 3 of their rebuild as well, and if it wasn't for an injury to Chet Holmgren this offseason, I would at least be willing to entertain the argument that OKC is looking to compete for the play-in. Not that they don't have other solid players. Giddey could make a second-year leap. Santa Clara's Jalen Williams is a sleeper for all rookie in my opinion, and there are other rookies and sophomores who could produce on this roster. They do also have Lou Dort, who they extended, but young players are rarely enough to move the needle for wins. As a team with so many future picks, all of their current young players will need to improve over this season to keep a secure spot. This is a prove-it year for Bazley and for Poku, and Theo Maledon may find himself as a training camp cut after being considered one of the steals of the second round 2 years ago. Whoever survives the team's camp battles will be under a microscope this season as Sam Presti decides whose game will work best around SGA, Giddey, and Chet. Overall, I think this many teams tanking for the first pick will make the year super unpredictable. Maybe one of these teams has an amazing developmental story and they climb a tier higher. Maybe the playoff or play-in teams get an injury or just generally disappoint us and they move into this tankers tier. I'm really excited about the upcoming NBA season, and much of that will focus on the really good NBA teams that are competing for the playoffs. But I did want to still spend some time on the franchises that are carefully developing plans to ascend to playoff contention relatively soon. But that's all I have for you in this one. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and leave a comment telling me what you thought of my tiers and rankings. And subscribe for more videos like this, but most importantly, enjoy the rest of your day.